Welcome to the Sports Science Dudes. I'm your host, Dr. Jose Antonio, with my co-host, Dr. Tony Ricci. If you're a first-time listener, hit the subscribe button and like the show. We're on YouTube, Rumble, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Today, our special guest is Dr. Bret Contreras, and I hope I don't screw up where you went to school. You got your PhD.
I don't get called doctor very often.
Well, hey, you got the title, man. So, hey, PhD from University, AUT. What does that stand for?
Auckland. It's New Zealand. Auckland, New Zealand.
Okay, God, you went all the way to the other side of the world for that. Interesting. But you got your master's degree from the party capital of the United States, Arizona State University.
Yeah. grew up in Phoenix, so.
By the way, ASU is a beautiful campus. It is a party campus, though. My sister went there, so I visited. I was like, wow, I really like this place. But it's a beautiful place, beautiful campus. You're also a certified strength and conditioning specialist with distinction from the NSCA. You're a research associate with the University in New Zealand, Auckland, author of Glute Lab, co-author of Strong Curves, author of Body Weight, Strength Training Anatomy, author of many things, but you are a founder. I think what you're most known for is you're founder of Booty Bob Bret. It reminds me of the Seinfeld episode. You remember that, Tony? The ass man. So
I never watched Seinfeld, believe it or not.
What?
Come on, I grew up with 30 Seinfelds. I didn't need to see them on TV. So
that's true. Your whole life was a Seinfeld. In fact, you know what? You live in Boca. Boca is one big Seinfeld episode.
It is a Seinfeld episode. You're right.
You go to a restaurant and you're like, holy crap, this is a Seinfeld episode. But hey, Bret is now our neighbor. Bret lives in Fort Lauderdale, although he's stuck in Atlanta. Welcome to the free state of Florida. We know you left the People's Republic of California. And you know what? 500,000 people have left that state in like the last 2 or 3 years.
Wow.
500,000. And ironically, Florida has gained almost 500,000. Hence, I don't know, Brad, if you looked at housing costs, hence they have skyrocketed in the last 2 years. So it's crazy because everyone.
I bought mine in the worst time, 8% interest rate.
Holy
wow, 8.
Yeah.
God dang. Yeah, well, hey, timing is everything, and buying a home is definitely depends a lot on timing. Now, speaking of timing, let's talk about this very interesting study that came out of Mike Roberts' lab. It was done by, I think, his PhD student, Daniel Plotkin. And I'm sure you've gotten 101 questions about it. And just to make sure I don't screw things up, I printed out the abstract just so I have, some of the top line details here. But before I go over some specific questions, because there's some interesting data from this. One, I want to mention that anyone who does a training study, these are hard as hell to do.
Mm-hmm.
So when people just get on social media, and it's easy to critique these studies because it doesn't take any skill to be a critic. I mean, there's 5 trillion critics on Twitter and Instagram, but these are really hard to do. They're incredibly difficult. In fact, I almost always tell grad students to not do training studies. It's like, if you want to torture yourself, do a training study. So why don't you, Bret, give us sort of your top line view of the data, what you expected before it started and what surprised you.
Okay. So it's kind of, I'll tell you the backstory. In 2020, this Barbalho study was published with Paulo Gentile's group. And I mean, I looked at it and I'm like, this is so fake. If you train people for a living like I do, I'm in the gym all day long. I work with people, you take a group of women, they're going to gain a lot more hip thrust strength than back squat strength. It's like leg press, hip thrusts are like leg press. You gain a lot more leg press strength than squat strength,
Right.
And I looked at them like, these numbers are fake. Also, this whole group's data is always too clean. Everything's perfect. I've published a lot of studies, especially with my colleague Brad Schoenfeld, and we're always trying to make sense of the data. We're like, well, why'd this work for the biceps but not the quads? Like, what do you think's the answer? We're always wrong. We joke that we're wrong 50% of the time with our hypotheses, and everything came out perfect with their labs always. So I never read a study and think like, oh, that's fake. And what sucks is these bad apples make people so suspicious. I don't want people suspicious of, like, now everyone's like, oh, that study's fake. And it's very rare. There's only a couple people in our industry who have faked studies, who at least been caught. But I remember a year prior to this calling James Krieger, Brad Schoenfeld, Andrew Vygotsky. I'm saying this lab's data is fake. Look at all. It always comes out too neat. And I've never suspected studies to be fake. So when this study was published, I looked at it. It was from Paula Gentile's lab. And I'm like, oh, it's fake. So I came out with a critique of it saying it's fake. And then I got so much crap for it. Everyone's like, oh, Bret can't accept that hip thrusts suck. And he's just playing the card of like, this author doesn't look like he even lifts. When I did mention, like, it was one small part of what I mentioned. He looks like some 20-year-old kid. You think he's really, the results for the squats would be greater than Louis Simmons could have gotten. I mean, really, like, he took like, and I guess I'm not supposed to notice that. Like,
Let me ask you this. No, Bret, because yeah, when we all read studies, 99% of the time you're like, okay, that kind of makes sense, whether it shows something or not. What was the red flag in that study in particular when you were reading it? You're like, wait a minute, that just can't be real. Because, like, for instance, in the supplement industry, if you give a supplement and you're saying you're going to gain 10 pounds of lean body mass in 2 months, you're like, whoa,
yeah,
who the hell does that? So
HMB,
what was the red flag?
Yeah, HMB putting on more muscle than DECA. But yeah, it was the strength gains that first tipped me. I'm like, that does not happen. I remember calling my friend Alan Aragon. I'm like, picture Jenna doing squats for 12 weeks or hip thrusts for 12 weeks. She would gain 150 pounds in her hip thrust. She'd gain like 30, 40 pounds in her squat tops. But then I went through it and just picked it apart. So
the gains were just way beyond what you would expect just naturally. Yeah, okay.
We took regular lifters and made them into elite squatters with a terrible protocol. The protocol was this crazy periodization scheme. Like every week you're doing something radically different, including like crazy high reps with like 1 minute rest periods. Trying to do squats with like, sets of like 10 to 15 with 1 minute rest. You get to the 6th set, you can't even, a lot of women can't even do the bar if they did that.
Right. So you've gone through that, and so what was the genesis?
So Menno Henselman and I are on the phone, we're on Skype, and we're like, okay, I'm trying to tell him this study's fake because he thought it was real. And that's my problem with the evidence-based community. I'm the only one still in the gym. Like, they couldn't wait to make it in life so they could get out of the gym. And I couldn't wait to make it in life so I could be in the gym. I don't charge clients anymore. I haven't charged clients for 8 years. So I agree, they're super smart with studies, but they can't pick things apart. Like, that's not what really happened. If there's a fake study, they don't know it because they don't train people. So it was me trying to tell these people this study's fake and no one believing me. So, but it took Andrew Vygotsky, Greg Knuckles, all these guys, they created they actually created their own statistical tests and showed this infamous white paper that showed that all of Barbalho's studies were fake. And then he vanished. He disappeared from the world. He closed his Instagram account and never appeared again. And then Paulo Gentile's kind of turned to the dark side. Now he's just bashing hip thrusts left and right, still quoting his fake fabricated studies that everyone knows are fake. And he just, he just continues to fabricate, lie, whatever. So he's been kind of ostracized from the community, but he's in Brazil where there's only a couple of countries that speak Portuguese. So he gets away with it because they're all so naive to the world, but whatever. So when I was talking to Menno, we agreed we need to duplicate this with like a better periodization scheme and actually use MRI because their study used ultrasound and I've used ultrasound. I bought this $13,000 ultrasound unit back in the day and I used it on one taste it. I'm like, I don't like this. I like things like horizontal, like broad jump. You start here, you land here, you measure that distance. There's no way you can screw it up. The ultrasound gets tricky with, it's like with biceps, it's easy. With glutes, there's not a bone underneath. You can't really, so you've got to see the fascial border and it's sometimes you know, unless you're an ultrasound tech, like I'm adjusting the depth, the gain, and I can't see on a couple subjects, I can't see the fascial board. I'm like, what am I doing wrong?
Right.
So I wasn't comfortable. So you have to be highly skilled to do ultrasound. And I don't know if ultrasound is highly reliable with glutes even. Anyway, so we wanted MRI. Well, we didn't know how expensive it was going to be. So we talked about it. We said, we need to do this. But then COVID happened, the world kind of, and then a couple of years later, I'm like, you know what, this study needs to be done. Mike Roberts reached out to me for he wanted my opinion about something. While I had him on the phone, I'm like, Mike, you have access to MRI? Let's do a squat hip thrust study. Do you have any student that could do it? Oh, I got Daniel Plotkin. That'd be great. I'll fund it. How much would it be? Well, it'd be 80 grand. I'm like, oh my God, what did I get myself into? So then coincidentally, Menno emails me. He's like, let's do this. And I'm like, well, coincidentally, Menno, I just contacted Mike Roberts, but the problem is it's MRIs. It's going to cost 80 grand. He's like, let's do it. I'll split it with you. And I'm like, what? Menno split it with me. Menno saved me 40 grand. So he split it with me.
Wow, that's damn good.
Fantastic. Wow.
And so glad. So they conducted the study. It's so funny reading these critics that are like, Bret planned the study to give a hip thrust an advantage. No, squats had an advantage. We can talk about that. But anyway, we had we had minor input into the design of the study, but for the most part, Daniel and Mike planned it. They carried it out. They analyzed the data. We really didn't have much input whatsoever, but it was the first legit study of its kind. And here's where so what we wanted to do too was measure EMG, because I thought EMG would be predictive of hypertrophy.
As did everyone else.
Mhm.
And it wasn't. And it's because probably because the squat gets you deeper and has more passive forces, whereas EMG doesn't measure stretch, it measures active forces. So anyway, I can roll through the data. Here's some interesting things. The glute medius and minimus didn't grow that much. The squat group only 0.8% increases in muscle cross-sectional area. For the glute medius and minimus, we combine those because it's hard to delineate the two.
Right.
The hip thrust group gained 3.2%, so not much. I thought the hip thrust group would gain more glute med and because you feel it when they do hip thrust, you can feel their upper glutes and they contract, but it didn't result in hypertrophy. Glute max gains were very similar. And we measured 3 areas, which by the way, in the research, you don't see the low glute max in the research is never really the low glute max. It's mid. So we measured way down low by like the gluteal fold. And I thought squats would get the same with lower glute max because EMG shows that low glute max it shows that basically there's different innervations like branches of the nerve. So you get more upper glute max EMG with hip thrusts compared to squats. So I thought they'd tie for the low glute max, but then the upper and mid would be higher with hip thrust. No, for the lower glute max, the hip thrust group gained 21.5%, the squat group 19.2%. Middle glute max 10.7 versus 10.1 for the hip thrust for squats, and upper 13.7 versus 12.8. So very similar across the board, which I was so shocked. And also EMG did not predict hypertrophy. Glute minimus and medius didn't grow. Hamstrings didn't grow much. 0.8% for the hip thrust group, 1.6% for the squat group. I thought they would grow for the hip thrust group because a lot of people feel their hamstrings during the hip thrust. Unsurprisingly, everyone probably would have predicted. Quads grew about twice as much in the squat group as they did the hip thrust group, 12.6% for squats versus 6.8% for hip thrusts. And the adductors grew more for squats, 10.3% for the squat group and 4.1% for the hip thrust group. Now, for strength gains, the squat group obviously gained more squat strength. They gained basically 49 pounds, and the hip thrust group put 19 pounds on their squat without squatting. Same thing with the hip thrust group. They put 116 pounds on their hip thrust. Then the squat group put 59 pounds on their hip thrust. So that's the rule of specificity. That's unsurprising. What was surprising though was they gained similar deadlift and horizontal wall pushing gains. So there's a lot of isometric tests you can do off the force plate. People like to do the isometric mid-thigh pull. Well, for my PhD, I developed the wall push test, where you basically stand at a 45-degree angle, pushing as hard as you can in the wall, and you measure the horizontal forces. I thought hip thrust would get more wall push strength for pushing forward. Hip thrust gained 6.7 pounds of wall push strength, whereas squats gained 5.1, so very similar. And they both gained 20.3 pounds of deadlift strength.
Wow.
Exact transfer the deadlift. So we're kind of left with some questions like, because maybe you get more, are there different mechanisms to hypertrophy? Are there passive and active signaling mechanisms? And if so, would you get better results doing both? Same with strength gains on the deadlift. Would squats get you more strength off the floor, whereas hip thrust would help you more at the lockout? Right. And then theoretically, most people who are logical would conclude with, you should probably do both. But our industry is not like that. They're very polarizing. So the people who love squats, the power lifters, the hip thrust haters, they're like, see, I told you, just squat. And it's like, would they have said the same thing if a study showed that military press and lateral raises both grew the side delts equally as well? No, people would be like, you should do both. Chin ups and curls both grew the biceps similarly. People would be like, yeah, you'd get better results doing both. But our industry is very jealous of the hip thrust, and it's because it's the only exercise invented that's got popular from a person. I hear it all the time. You never invented it. It was around forever. In fact, Jose, I even saw you wrote one time, we were doing this in the Tamily Webb days, and I contacted Tamily Webb from Buns of Steel. I said, did you ever do weighted hip thrust? And she said, never weighted, Bret. Big fan. I'd love to collaborate one day. And I thought it'd be cool if we did like Buns of Steel revolutionized. But anyway,
that's funny.
There's a lot of people don't really believe that I invented it. It's funny, but
the question I have is, I thought was one of the more interesting things, and you already alluded to it, was that the hamstrings didn't respond, which, and when you're out in the field, I mean, training athletes, to me, if I were just to look at athletes who have nice hamstrings, it's usually sprinters. So what do sprinters do? Well, they sprint. They do uphill running. So the question I have for you is a pragmatic one. If someone says, hey, I want to have hamstrings like a sprinter, would it be in the weight room, or a combination of weight room and uphill sprinting? What would it be?
This is stuff I love talking about. Look at sprinters before weights were popular, like Jesse Owens. He wasn't muscular.
Nope.
It's the weight room.
Right.
It's the weight room getting these sprinters jacked.
Yeah, so even Carl Lewis wasn't built in any manner like that, right?
And Johnson was.
Well, Johnson was a brick. Yeah.
So what would it be to?
Great point.
Hamstrings are tough to develop.
Well, I think the hamstrings. There's this debate over where you get peak hamstring forces right before touchdown or right during ground contact, but like the leg is more straightened out. It's more lengthened at that point. So if you want to grow your hamstrings, you do things that stretch them. Stiff leg deadlifts, seated leg curls.
Now I do have, I don't know if you have the paper in front of you, but if you look at and I hate to do this to the audience, but on figure 6 of the paper, and hopefully you can see what I'm referring to. It's the change in cross-sectional data, the upper, middle, and lower glute. And this is where, when you show individual data points versus group data, it can almost be more confusing. So if I just look at upper glute, hip thrust versus squat, well, it looks like, if you want to look at individual data points, hip thrusts work much better for some people, but some people shrunk. Figure that one out. Some people had atrophy, some people had extreme hypertrophy, although the mean it's about the same. Same with the middle glute. If you look at the middle glute cross-sectional area, one of the hip thrust subjects atrophied. Okay, I'm like, okay, this is weird. And the reason I find it so odd is that untrained people, I always say, if you pick your nose, you'll get a training response if you're untrained. How can an untrained person atrophy? Or is it it's an issue with the measurement technique?
Mhm.
Yeah, it looks like 3 of the
Three.
subjects for the upper glute,
Shrunk.
and then 3 were at 0. So 6 of, I think there were 18 subjects. A third of them upper glutes didn't grow from hip thrust.
Right. And that's,
I agree. Is it the measurement? We used MRI, but like,
yeah.
yeah, have you ever trained someone who didn't grow at all? No, I don't know. But then also, yeah, you have some people putting
We're putting on a lot.
a lot. So it's like, and then you look at the lower glute max, look at that one person up there.
Yes.
Squats were way in the middle. Squats
You
were
could-
kind of consistent in the middle, whereas the hip thrust, you got these great responders and non. But that always, I love when people report individual data points, so you can see the range, and it's like maybe hip thrusts are so popular because you get those top people.
That's
Look at I just hip thrusts on Instagram. All I do is hip thrusts, and they're those top responders to it. But yeah, we need to figure out why is that the case?
yeah,
It's a
because
consideration.
you would suspect untrained people are going to respond like crazy just
Yeah.
because they're doing something brand new. So I thought that was just the most intriguing part of this, in addition to the fact that there was there's an uncoupling of EMG data versus the hypertrophic response. So let me ask you this. Would you even trust EMG data as a predictor for hypertrophy at all?
Ugh, like I was like really big on the EMG movement back in the day. And now I have to kind of like like I want to update my glute lab book now. It's like I based a lot of my initial, now I always knew that like Andrew Vygotsky is he was my intern back in the day. He's the main guy criticizing it. But I always thought like at equal ranges of motion, if you do 10 rep maxes, like similar rep ranges and similar tempos, then yes, you could use it. But no, it needs to be, it's almost should be worked into a modeling where they look at the passive stretch, and it would be useful for active force contribution. But we have a lot to learn along those lines. That's what Brad's actually Daniel Plotkin wants to do his PhD in that area, like, and Mike Roberts' lab, and they're interested in looking at, and Brad has a colleague Henning Wakaraj or whatever, he's some European country, I can't remember which, but he's really big on like what are the exact mechanisms. Everyone's quoting Titan, which is funny because when I went to AUT, when I went to Auckland, I studied under John Cronin. He had me researching Titan like crazy, but back then it was because it was back when we went to school, it was 2 components, actin and myosin. Then we learned that Titan bound to the actin, and then it made a stronger, basically a stronger eccentric contraction, especially because the first paper on this was this winding filament, but it didn't turn out to be true. But this research out of NAU thought that it wound up like like those toys you wind up and then let it go. But that's not exactly what happens. It just bounds, and then the part that's unbound gets is the stiff segment. It just it lends. It's like a rubber band. It lends a lot of force. Then along the way we learned that it's probably a hypertrophy signaling mechanism. But right now people are saying it's just Titan, but it's probably everything. Probably everything signals hypertrophy. There's the extracellular matrix,
Right.
the nucleus, like everything probably can signal hypertrophy. We don't know, but if it's just Titan just responds to stretch. So it's like, or maybe active stretch, but it's like, what about actual contraction? How hard you're squeezing? You'd think that there'd be a mechanism with that too. So that's where Henning said that could be, I always get this wrong, bag C, filament 3, bag C or something like that in the Z discs.
Mhm.
But the point is, we don't know. And it's hard to figure this stuff out. In probably 10, 20 years, we'll know way more. And then we'll be able to predict more with hypertrophy. But right now it's kind of early times for that.
Yeah, 10 to 20 years from now, I don't know if we'll know way more, or we'll just know more and just be more confused because new information keeps getting added. All of those things contribute to hypertrophy. And I think though, you're a pragmatist, from a pragmatic point of view, when I did my dissertation back in the 90s, looking at muscle fiber hyperplasia and using a stretch model, and stretch does play a role in inducing hypertrophy and even possibly hyperplasia, that from a practical standpoint, training really hasn't changed. We know these cellular mechanisms. You can go back to old muscle and fitness articles in the 70s and 80s, but training has not appreciably changed from then till now. I mean, you still got to work, tension overload is still key. I mean, there's other things that play a role with the, data on, what am I thinking of? The, blood flow occlusion, so we're learning, getting information from that, but you still train people the same way. You train them hard. You alternate, possibly high weights, low weights, rep ranges, exercise selection. In your opinion, what is so dramatically different, if anything, between 2023 and the year 2000, or even the year 1990?
So you can go back and look at the way Arnold trained. Now, so for men, things haven't changed that much. I think now we're really starting to this optimal crowd has shuffled in, and I think I started that, and then now I don't like it because it went too far. Because it gets to where do this exercise, but it's like don't ever take your focus off the basics. Like, I always say my big six: squats, deadlifts, hip thrusts, and then chin-ups, military press, and bench press. But for men, here's the deal. With men, the industry, okay, you can go back to the muscle and fitness magazines, Flex, all the Weider, like bodybuilding, they never talked about glutes. And they still don't. It's weird. But then all women's magazines are focused on glutes. So what I would say is what's changed significantly is glute training, because when I came up, glutes weren't mentioned, and they grew as you did legs. If you did squats and lunges and back extensions, and stiff leg deadlifts and stuff, they would grow. And this study shows that they do grow from squats, but I think women care as much about glutes as we do every upper body muscle combined. Like a lot of women, they like their bodies. They're like, I like my legs. They're nice and slender. My upper body's fine. But I need more glutes. I need a rounder butt. And they just want glutes. And then the men have such a hard time with that because we like training the full body. And you'll hear bodybuilders scoff at the way women train now. They're like, you should train legs hard. A lot of women just want, and I train a lot of bikini competitors and even wellness competitors. With wellness, you need big legs, but now the wellness competitors are dealing with girls getting injections and stuff.
Oh shit.
So if they're not getting injections, then they need to have, so they're being told your legs overpower your glutes. And the bikini competitors are being told your legs are fine, you need glutes, you need more upper glutes. So it's like these girls are having to not train legs much. Also, if you train models, runway models, they can't have huge legs. But a lot of them have flabby butts from behind. A lot of bikini competitors, flabby butts, and they want to tone them up. And I think the industry has a hard time accepting that girls just want to go to the gym and do, a whole hour of just glutes and 3 days a week. And by the way, it is hard to train glutes 3 days a week. It's boring. You can't do so much squats and deadlifts and lunges and recover from it. So it's like you add in a lot of the kickbacks, the abduction, the hip thrust, and that's how you get your best glutes. So I would say that's changed significantly, because when we grew up in the 90s, it was you train legs 1 day a week, you annihilate that, you do squats, you do leg press, you do leg extensions, you do leg curls, and then you do stiff leg deadlifts. And that's how it was. And then now it's train legs 3 times a week, but a lot of glute work added in, especially abduction, kickbacks, things like that are way more popular now. And obviously the whole hip thrust category. And now these machines are coming in. So that's what's changed a lot, is now the most popular machines right now, all the manufacturers are building these glute drives. And like because you had the Booty Builder, and then you had like the Nautilus glute drive, and then now every manufacturer is making them. And it makes hip thrusting so much easier, loading plates onto something rather than setting up a barbell on the ground. So that's kind of the wave of the future. So that is, but the principles don't change, the principles of you got to get stronger. We always are trying to push the boundaries on training to failure and versus not. What's the ideal rest time? Brad Schoenfeld's real big on all that research. But is it very different than what a lot of it's kind of just validating what bodybuilders have done for a long time.
Yeah, right. And, if you go back, even go back to the old strongmen 50 and 60 years ago, it's at the end of the day, it's pretty much, it's still overload. You got to induce that, and it's still training specificity. I do have a question about, general hypertrophy of the lower extremity, where people focus on quads versus hams. And actually, there's a big chunk of muscle there that if you dissected, people would be shocked how large the adductor groups are. And yet, no one ever says, I need to work on my adductors. So someone comes to you, Brett, maybe you need to makes a machine that is focuses on the adductor muscle, especially the Adductor Magnus. It's a big ass thick muscle. If you ever get to dissect it, it is like a chunk of meat. How would you target the Adductor Magnus? Well, I guess longest and brevis, but really the Magnus.
Okay, so I'm so curious about this question because I have no quads, but I have big adductors. So it's like,
What the hell?
I know I can't get quads to save my life, but my adduct, and I can take the stack on my adductor machine and hit 70 reps with it. I bought this special pin. It looks like the end of a barbell sleeve.
Mhm.
It sticks into the weight stack, and I can put 200-pound plates on there and still get 12 reps. And the stack goes up to 305. So it's 505 pounds for 12 reps still. I've never met someone with stronger adductors than me, but I think I get more adductor growth from squatting and lunging than I do from the adductor machine. But maybe you get more adductor longus and brevis with the adductor machine, but the Adductor Magnus, I think, responds best to hip extension. And there's a couple of studies that indicate that. And so I don't think you can max, but I think adductors look awesome.
It gives your legs, your your thighs a full look.
A nice sweep. Yeah.
I remember Marcus Rule back in the day. Remember him?
There's an old name.
Because I used to read all the bodybuilding mags, and he was like, my adductors are my strong point. So why not even, I do 4 sets of 20 on the adductor machine. And ever since I read that, I'm like, I'm going to do the adductor machine. And I always have. But if you haven't done the adductor machine in a while, do not go do 4 sets. Same with cat raises. You do 1 set and then you wait a few days and you do it. Otherwise you will be crippled. You won't be able to walk.
I can't imagine how that would hurt near the groin. So that can't be the best pain. No, another one I hear people arguing about is, in addition just to regular back squat, the utility of a sumo squat and how far apart your feet are supposed to be. And this idea, I don't know what video it was, or maybe I saw on Instagram about one of the trainers were telling someone to open your hips. And when I don't know about you, but opening your hips isn't technically a biomechanical term that makes sense. Are they talking about adducting, or what exactly is opening the hips?
I'm sorry, Joe, you asked a sumo squat or dad?
This was during a sumo squat.
Sumo squat, okay.
Personal trainers are telling, guys and girls to open your hips when you do it, when that has no meaning in kinesiology, opening your hips.
Well, knees out. It's the Louis Simmons, knees out. Dave Tate, Wendler's, knees out.
So that's hip.
I don't mean, well, it's hip abduction and then some external rotation components.
Right, it's hip abduction.
When you get into hip flexion, it's like, do you rotate out too? Are you doing some extra rotation with it? But yeah.
So it's okay. So it's external rotation of the hip.
Well, it's abduction, but
with external
more so in the horizontal plane. As you get deeper in a squat, your knees out. Yeah.
And so what is the utility of that when you're doing a sumo squat? Because a lot of this is conjecture. I mean, sort of like.
Oh, this study leads to hypothesis generation, because here's what the optimal crowd brought in and said. They said, don't ever do sumo because you decrease the stretch on the glutes. But I would say is no, you want to go, abduction extra rotation. A lot of different studies shows higher EMG. So they would argue stretch and I would argue EMG. And this study, because squats tie at hip thrusts, it seems like now they'll tie. Like the stretch is important, but activation is important too. Which one is more important? So
Right.
now I kind of think you should do them both. You should do things where you have more of a narrow stance and you sink as deep as possible to get more stretch, and then things where you're turned out and wider stance to get more active force production. Because when you widen your stance, if you look at the glute, how it's the functional anatomy of it, you think the fibers would be better aligned as you go wider, but
Right.
it depends on the region of the glutes. But yeah, so now we need a study on that, because my guess is that you'd see similar growth. But yeah, you should probably do both. Some things do with a narrower stance going deeper, some things doing with because a lot of people like myself, if I do sumo, I can barely get to parallel. But if I go narrow stance, I can get way deeper.
Right.
Depends on your hip anatomy.
Yeah, I would work the opposite on that probably, yeah.
Tony, does any of this, I mean, when you're training performance athletes, particularly, I mean, you work with fighters, are these, I would imagine these are not typically the kinds of questions that would come up when you're dealing with people who want to enter a cage or a ring and they're trying to knock people out or grapple or whatever. But still, they got to lift weights and you still got to program it. So.
Well, you're right. I think, well, first of all, Brett, you'll be happy to know that your movement has a big role in fight performance. So despite the fact that some people out there are more interested, I think, in proving themselves right than accurate, right? I can't say enough good about the hip thrust and its utility, and it can be done unilaterally. We do it explosively. We fire them up on the wall and catch our feet on the wall. I mean, there's a host of ways we vary the movement. But the truth is, guys, this type of detail or this type of variation, it isn't that it doesn't have great value nor that it should not be addressed. It's just really a question of time. Like, what can we get in and what is the least dose we can do for the fight sport athlete and, optimally have a carryover. So do I have time, for example, to look at the rotation of the feet and move the hips out, or bring them in, bring them narrow, and always worry about depth and stretch? I wish I did, but unfortunately, first, their training volumes are super physiological to begin with. So what we try to do is stay relatively basic and conservative, in the application, and try to get the best response for the least dose. Now, there are some times where you'll take a look at an athlete and, and this is something I would ask too to you, Brett, like, how maybe like segment length, for an example, might affect the hip thrust, or the longer leg versus the shorter leg, high torso, long. But my point is too, even there, Joey, is that we'll take the quality that may be least present, if you will, right? They don't have the strength, or they don't have the firing power, or in some cases they have great endurance, no strength, or vice versa. And then we'll try to apply the movement that may have the greatest carryover accordingly. And usually it's a low dose or we don't have a room for great variation in their movement applications because of that. They just don't, as Brett was saying earlier, you can't train heavy glutes 3 days a week, right? I can't load these guys at 4 or 5 different leg angles 2 to 3 times a week and worry about that when their training volumes are so crazy. But so what we do is I'll take a discussion such as this and go, okay, where am I going to get the best response? And what's probably the best positioning according to what they need. But a lot of that's individual. You can't, just like in training here, what Brett was mentioning, all fighters need the same biomotor qualities to excel, but they don't possess those qualities equally, whether it's the previous training stimulus or whether it's genetics, as an example, right? A 6'1" lightweight probably doesn't have the same qualities as 5'6" lightweight. There's a reason why they both have the same weight with different limb length, different muscle density, and so forth. So we find what the person needs and try to make the best application accordingly. But I was going to ask you too about that, Brett, what are some of the factors, right? Like, are there any things I do need to consider in the movement if I'm working with a woman who has generally pretty long legs and not shorter torso, or even an athlete, or do these impact the movement at all? Or could they impact the rate of hypertrophy that we even saw in a study,
You know, it's funny, in this paper, there was a 6'9" guy,
Whoa,
couldn't
Wow.
squat deep. He couldn't even come close to parallel, but his glute growth was great.
Right, right.
He was doing quarter squat, like his legs, all I saw was a silhouette. Daniel showed me the silhouette. This guy had the most challenging squat dimensions I have ever seen. It was like, I think his femur was as long as his head, neck, and trunk.
oh my God.
And so, I mean, but the guy's glutes grew. So I don't know if we can say anything on, I think your glute growth has more to do with your physiology, not your anatomy and biomechanics, but it does, the anthropometry absolutely affects. For example, you see some of these NBA players, their tibias are like 3 feet
Right.
tall. And so you
Right,
know,
right.
they need a taller bench because you want
Yeah.
to basically you want to be level at the top. You'll see
Okay.
short people, if they use too tall of a bench at the lockout, they're slanted down. The NBA players are slanted that way.
Right.
And it's like it's an awkward, so they should be using a taller bench, but your tibia or basically your knee height matters. But then also if you're all legs, you shouldn't touch down. If you've got a
Okay.
short torso, reverse in midair. But, and you might have to slide up the bench higher to not slide down, but in general, you can get everyone hip thrusting well, more so than you can with squats. Squats, some people are so challenging, you know.
I have no doubt on that. Yeah, no
I
doubt.
did want to comment on athletic stuff because I remember reading a study back, this must have been 10, 15 years ago, but it looked at, you looked at cutting side to side. And I always thought of like, all right, jumping is hip extension, sprinting is hip extension, cutting side to side is hip abduction, and then swinging is hip rotation, but it's really not. When you swing, it's actually, hip extension.
Yes,
The hip is extending there,
that's right.
extending, rotating, and abducting at the same time. When you're throwing, and so this study showed that hip abduction, when you cut side to side, hip extension strength was more related to cutting ability than hip abduction strength. And that got me thinking way back in the day. And I was like, for sports, I think the end range hip extension strength is important. But also, one thing I learned with training athletes, and I haven't trained athletes in a long time. I used to, 2006 to like 2009, I trained a lot of athletes. They would all have some crazy individual weakness. I remember this, like, training a guy who couldn't do a Bulgarian split squat. He could do 3 wobbly ones. So I got him to where he could do 20 of them in his athletic performance. I remember training a guy who was he was a dunk contest guy. And I would put him on the 45-degree hyper. He would grind out bodyweight reps like shaking. Like I could sit there and bust out, I think I've done 100 reps before I was annihilated, but he was grinding them out like shaking. So I'm like, God, I got to get you better at these. And then you strengthen up a weak link in the chain, and it helps them out a lot.
Mhm.
I remember training a guy in Auckland. He was a CrossFitter. I go to give him barbell glute bridges, and I had 135 pounds on the bar. He couldn't lift. He couldn't get it off. This guy could squat 450 and deadlift 495. He could not get 135 pounds off the ground. I was like, I thought something was wrong. I know. He just was so weak at end range hip extension. So I said, all right, here's your program. For the next 30 days, I want you doing bodyweight glute bridges every day. I want you doing for 30 straight days. And I want you to, the CrossFitters all have GHDs. So I'd have him do back extension off the GHD. Same thing. He'd do a bodyweight back extension. He'd be shaking at the top. I said, just do 2 sets of each every day. He put 60 pounds on his deadlift from doing those 2 things.
Wow.
Now
Yeah.
he's my best friend. So we have to think more of just these individual studies and look at what you were talking about, Jose, these individual data points and going, this person blew up from. So it's like we start looking at weak links and how you can strengthen those athletes' weak links. Because if you have a big repertoire, and now with like JB Morin's colleagues, their research showing that like looking at their force velocity curves and seeing which end they're dominant with, you can do a lot of good. So yeah, if you've got the guy who, I remember training this power lifter, his first time ever hip thrusting, he got 315 for 20 reps. I think he could have kept going. He just got tired.
Oh,
That was insane. Yeah. And it took me like 2 years to get to that point of hip thrusting, you know, and he did his first time. And then you have other guys who, well, like Lane Norton was always so weak at hip thrusts. I thought it was so funny. Now he's gotten stronger at them. But I think it helps your deadlift lockout, especially if you round. If you're a power lifter and you round, the lockout is hard. Ideally, we'd all pull with a good arch, and then the lockout's easier when you round. So it's so much more complex than people may want to make it out to be.
Oh, it's super complex. In fact, speculate on this. If you got trained people and you create the program, comparing hip thrusts to squats. Now, I think it'd be interesting if you get trained people and put them on something that helps them, helps promote the gain in lean body mass, i.e. help PEDs, but you can't do PEDs. Let's say you put them on creatine. Speculate on what you think would happen in a group of highly trained, resistance trained individuals, male and female, hip thrust versus squat. Would there be a difference?
So I think you can, well, okay. The problem with these studies, you have to volume equate. But everyone knows
Nobody volume equates in the real world.
in the real world, you don't have to volume equate. So,
Yeah.
so everyone knows you can do more hip thrusts than squats, especially if you're training close to failure. Like squats annihilate me. If I do 4 sets to failure, you know, it's
You're done. You're
yeah,
done.
you're done. And really to failure though, people really don't train to failure. Like if I go 4 sets to failure, they kill me. Hip thrusts still beat me up 4 sets to failure, but the way a lot of people train, you know, like, but the hip thrust, I could do them. I could probably do hip thrusts 3 times a week if I wanted to, if that's all I did. Squats twice a week. Deadlifts 4 sets to failure, 1 day a week.
Mhm.
You know, so you say, to create the optimal plan, I'm gonna hip thrust more often. I'm gonna squat, and you use these like abduction kickbacks. Those don't. That's like, I call it penalty-free volume. You know, especially when you're accustomed to it, they don't beat you up. Especially band work. Everyone wants to bash bands. Bands are amazing to me because they add penalty-free volume. You put people doing band abduction work and their upper glutes grow. Yes, we could say they're not getting a stretch, but they grow. I've done it a million times with a million athletes. But anyway, an optimal program, I think, would have having you do squatting motions a couple times a week, having you thrusting or kickback motions a few times a week, and abduction. But if you just did squats versus hip thrusts with volume equated, maybe they'd tie. But in my opinion, you should go by perceived recovery. Like you can go again once you feel recovered. It's auto-regulated. And my guess is that, say you did it for 10 weeks, the squat group would probably get 20 sessions in. The hip thrust group would probably get 30 sessions in. And you might, you know, and so they'd get more volume in, more theoretically more blood flow, because you get this, the squat stretches you more, but you don't get a pump. The hip thrust shuttles more blood into there, you get more of a pump, more of a burn. So, and that's argued about whether it's all tension versus does metabolic stress, does the pump, does cell swelling add? We don't really know yet. A lot of what we do know is that tension is king. What we don't know is a lot of the industry is already convinced, no, metabolic stress doesn't do anything, cell swelling doesn't do anything, muscle damage doesn't do anything. And I'm not convinced of the idea. I hope it's true because training is a lot easier then. Because right now I want to do my lunges because they get my glutes the sorest. I feel guilty if I don't do them.
Right.
If I don't get a pump, if I never get a glute pump or I'm trying to build all my muscles. I want to get a biceps pump. If I don't, I feel like I'm leaving something on the table. I hope I'm wrong, because then you don't have to worry about the pump. You don't have to worry about muscle damage. You don't have to worry about it's just tension, and you don't have to change up the rep ranges. You could just do your 3 sets of 8 and be fine. You don't have to do, 3 by
It simplifies it.
Yeah, it simplifies it. But anyway, I think hip thrust with advanced subjects, I think hip thrust would win. But what would be cool is to do an advanced group, an advanced study, and have a squat group, a hip thrust group, and a combined group. The combined group would be cool too, but that's Menno,
They would do better.
that's like adds 40 more thousand to the study. So plus Daniel, the way Jose, this being a professor, the way studies are done, Daniel was in charge of it. He was in the lab at, he was supervised all the training sessions. He was in the lab at 7 a.m. He was leaving at 6 p.m. He worked his ass off that semester. So you can't get it done. Everyone just thinks, oh, well, they should have done this. They should have done this. It's like one study can only do so much. But I think in your scenario, I think hip thrust would have won. But
yeah, well, I've always had an issue with trying to volume equate these studies, because in the real world, it makes no sense. And I'll give a non-resistance training example. When people compare HIIT training versus traditional steady state cardio or steady state aerobic training, if you volume equate it, of course, high intensity interval training will do better. But the point of doing, we could call LSD training long, slow distance, or steady state cardio or whatever. The point of doing that is you can do a lot more volume. If you look at elite endurance athletes, they typically do an 80-20 split. 80% of their training is low intensity cardio. The other 20% is super hard. And part of that is an artifact of the fact that they train so much that you can't possibly train hard all the time. So I'm with you. If you were to do a hip thrust versus squat study, the volume should be greater with hip thrusts because you can do more volume. I mean, equating them makes, and this is where a lot of these studies.
the advantage to the squat.
Right.
Just pointing out, I read these people going, he gave the advantage to he used beginners on purpose. He did this. And I'm like, no. I think when we did this stuff, I'm like, Daniel, that gives squats an advantage, but whatever. I know to get it published, we have to do that, but I wish, anyway, no one, you'll never please the critics.
Oh, you mean for this particular study where you have to volume? Okay.
Yeah.
You know what? Because I think it makes sense for a first study.
Agree.
Yeah. Not that people have tens of thousands of dollars to do them.
I know they wanted to use beginners because they wanted to see the most growth possible. And they point out that there's not that many, we don't have a lot of research showing that trained versus untrained. Yes, we have studies showing that stretching and cardio will build muscle and untrained. But as far as resistance training, do they respond totally different? There's not a lot of research showing that. But I agree. We need, and here's the deal. I've been lucky. I've been fortunate. I make a lot of money. I don't have kids. I'm not married. I'm happy to spend a lot of my money because I'm curious. I've always been so curious. I will fund more studies. The problem is there's not a lot of labs that have MRI and can carry out, resistance training studies. If there were, I'd be like Oprah, you get a study, you get funded.
No, and actually, MRI is the best way to do it. Some people have suggested muscle biopsies, but then you're talking about a very small, tiny part of a muscle, whether it's mid-belly or distal or proximal or whatever.
What Mike Roberts told me, he was talking to a guy who did glute. He said in the quads, you could do the biopsy, no big deal, but the glute max, it bleeds and it's uncomfortable and it hurts and it's almost unethical.
Almost.
US, it would be hard.
not totally unethical, just partly. Well, no, hey, we got to be respectful of your time. It sucks that you're stuck in Atlanta. Hopefully you'll get a flight back to Florida, back to the Sunshine
Tonight
State.
at 10 p.m. So
hey, tell the audience, do you have any upcoming projects or cool stuff happening in South Florida?
No, I didn't even, my glute lab, I've kept it I didn't even build a sign out. So it's been a private gym. I have this badass gym though in Fort Lauderdale. It's so amazing. It's kind of
located.
It's in Flagler Village in Fort Lauderdale, kind of the art district. But I go back to San Diego and visit, and it's almost like better. Like sometimes when you just have like a garage gym, you have better workouts than when you have access to the greatest gym. Because now for hamstrings, I have 7 hamstring machines. I've got the hammer strength, you know, the deadlift, the squat lunge, we do deadlifts off that. I've got all 3 types of leg curls, seated, lying, and kneeling. I've got a 45-degree hyper. My BC strength are the best. I've got the Nordic ham curl, and I've got a glute ham developer. And it's
You
like,
should have the biggest damn hamstrings in the world.
well, then it's like, okay, I want to do quads. I've got the pendulum squat, the hack squat, the belt squat, a leg press. And then what about squats and single leg stuff? I've got a leg extension. So it's like there's almost, and same with glutes, there's almost too many options. And I'm like, God, I haven't done belt squats in a while. Oh, and then it's too much variety and you're not plugging away on one thing. That you can have too much of a good thing, in my opinion.
Well, hey, if you need, any help from us or you need interns, we got a lot of good students. We got a lot of bad students, but we got a lot of good students too.
Yeah, we got some top guns, I think, that would love to be with you. We can work that out, Brett. That would be wonderful.
Let's talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for having me on, you guys. Thanks so much. I appreciate it. And anytime you want me back on, I'm happy to pop on.
Yeah, and I'm going to definitely come by. I'm just 25 minutes up the road, so I'd love to see the place. That'd be wonderful.
Thanks, Brett, for being on the Sports Science Dude. You are an official Sports Science Dude, so appreciate all your time.
My
Thanks
pleasure.
a lot.
Thanks, Brett.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.